Tillage. This is one that's there's a lot of information and a lot of local topics to hit here. One thing you'll notice, continuous no-till stayed fairly constant. There's no statistical difference there. In fact, we didn't have any statistical difference across all this, although you see that there's different numbers and that. But what we want to stand by is, was there enough evidence in our framework to say there was a difference? But at 25% continuous no-till, I know a lot of talk about stratification, and that was one of the leading causes. Well, only 25% of the acres you can put in that group. The others have periodic tillage, which should disrupt that stratification issue. So it's more than just stratification. You can't just put your finger on one thing and say, oh, it's no-till's fault. Well, no, it can't be all no-till's fault, because you've got so much that in here that is being mixed on a regular basis. So that gives you an idea. The way we define these, continuous conventional, is pretty obvious. It's conventional tillage on every crop that you have. Seasonal, conventional, at least one crop in the rotation is conventionally tilled. Continuous mulch is just that. It's some type of conservation tillage. We have a factor called stir that we calculate each implement's ability to disrupt the soil is given a value and a factor, and we add that up, and that tells us whether they're conventional, mulch, or no-till. Seasonal no-till has at least one system that is no-till, but none of the crops are grown with conventional tillage. So they just jumping in and out of pure no-till into at least one crop gets a little bit of disking of some type or another. And that's probably due to mixing fertilizers in their system. So that didn't change a lot. So we didn't get a lot of differences on erosion and other properties due to tillage, because they didn't change that a lot. But what it did tell us is that while the issue of stratification is being argued in research about its impact for those acres, at 25% of the region under systems that are continuously no-tilled, it's not the culprit that you can point one finger at. Here's an area that we've really started to pay more attention to in all of our analysis is the use of advanced technologies. Soil testing is not an advanced technology, but doing it a different way would be. We found there was no difference in the soil testing frequency. About 71% of the acres had a soil test that was at least 5 years old or younger. We did have some that were, actually we have one. We asked them what was the date of their last fertilizer test, soil test, and we had a 1971. That's our oldest in this region. In the national survey, we did have a 1954 soil sample. It was a very good soil sample, and to this day is still working for them, and they really rely on that one. If we could all only get soil tests like that. Nitrogen test, leaf petiole nitrogen test, things like that, more popular as you go to the west, especially in Iowa and parts of Illinois. It's gotten really popular. It hasn't really caught on here, but you do see 8%. We didn't have any noted in the 03-06. So just in a 5 or 6 year period, we saw a gain in that technology use. Nitrogen inhibitors, big jump. 8 to 30% are using nitrogen inhibitors. GPS of soil properties went from 8 to 36%. So we're starting to see a technological advance, which is key in this region, in the use of these types of information. So it's not that it's going to be new to a large part of this area. We're not throwing something out there that nobody's doing yet. There's some that are making advances in that, and it's moving forward. Variable rate technology, still at 14%. That's not great, but it was 4%. So we're seeing a good shift there. And with variable rate technology, going back to the soil test, which is one of our oldest things, but doing it on a gridded sample, either run from your yield monitor results or you grid it out by soil type or any other way, that is the next advancement in soil testing, and how can we better do that? And it's going to take time in economics. How frequently should we go back and do this? These are all research questions that need to be answered. That'll take some time to understand. So those are some of the advances that we saw. Here's some other results. And I talked about, a lot of times we talk about the few acres causing more problems. Jane, you said that 12% of the basin was in Indiana. We found that right over here on the right, those were all Indiana soils. No. You see that there's a few of the acres that are causing the majority of the problems or accounting for a lot of the loss. With respect to sediment, 1% of the acres are accounting for 35% of the sediment loss in the basin, and 4% are accounting for 57% of the average annual losses of sediment in the basin. That's a pretty good relationship there that you want to pay attention to. We'll talk a little later about the problem if you just don't run out there and find them that easily and treat them immediately. Not only is it that, on those few acres, but even for the other amounts of erosion that you have, it's the events. We're starting to look at the daily events. Haven't really developed a very elegant way to explain this, so I'm not going to do a very good job at it. But we're only looking at maybe 5 and 6 events in an entire year, and sometimes fewer than that. They're responsible for 80% of the losses. So from a perspective of managing with an average annual concept, does this meet the needs of a 4 and 5 day a year event? Can we do better? I don't know that we can, because obviously the average annual, those big events are in there in that average. But it's worth us to begin to look at in the world of conservation, what measures are we needing to address that can hit those 4 or 5%, or 4 or 5 days a year? Or are our current methods adequate? We just need to do more of them. I don't know the answer to that. Similar type activity you see with soluble nitrogen. You can see the majority are below this 25-pound threshold that we have out there. Don't get excited about what 25 pounds is and where it came from. We needed to have a mark in which when you stepped over, we felt like you needed to be extra conservation. If you're under it, don't worry about it until we move the line. So right now the 25 came up. We worked with a lot of researchers to try to strike an environmental and production balance. We did that with the sediment as well, and so the 25 came out of just a not a smoke-filled room anymore because none of them smoked, but to kind of get around and come up with a number, and all we needed was a number for analytical assessment. So don't put this in any type of water quality threshold or anything like that. But it just shows you the distribution, the cumulative percent of acres, and where the problems are arising from. These are pretty nice ways to look at the data to understand that it is the few acres out there that are causing the majority of the problems, and the other acres are fairly well treated. Total phosphorus, same story. We put a threshold of 2 pounds. And again, when we did the first analysis of the entire nation, we had the threshold set at 4 pounds. That seemed to work everywhere but here when you had a critical problem with the lake, and so we caught all kinds of grief for that because soluble nitrogen was the biggest problem in our report for the Great Lakes, and then everybody in this area knew that phosphorus was. Well, we set this national 4-pound standard and missed it. So on a regional study, we can tailor a little more. We cut that down in half. In fact, our next national study, we're probably going to go with a 2 or 3 pound national threshold because phosphorus is so pervasive as compared to nitrogen. And since it persists longer, we may want to drop that threshold a little bit more on a national basis. But this gives you an idea, what you're right at 40% of the acres are exceeding that 2 pound total threshold. For soluble, you can see it was a heck of a problem with the big black line there, but you've got about 44% of the acres are exceeding that 1 pound threshold for soluble phosphorus, and so you've got a big chunk of area to start addressing and bringing that down to 1 pound. I mean, you can say you want to get to a ½ pound, but why don't we get to 1 pound first, and then we can drop it. So let's manage in increments, because it'll take time and technology to get there. We developed a scoring system for analytical purposes to kind of address the 4 R's. We don't make any judgment on your form, so it's basically the scoring is on 3 of the 4 R's. But are you applying that form properly. So like with manure, if you're using manure, you've got to have incorporation. In fact, all of ours need some type of incorporation, be it knifed, banded, broadcast, and then disc right after the broadcasting. Some type of incorporation is required in our assessment to have a score. And we also score each crop in the rotation, and we come up with your phosphorus management, your nitrogen management, and several like that. So what we have here, you can see, is Chief Weller said this morning, and moderately high is probably, if you want to kind of equate this to 590 standard, moderately high is probably pretty close to 590. And then high is going beyond. It's pretty tough, pretty high bar. But you can see over 30% of the acres are in that category. Most of the acres are in the moderately high and high category. Over on the right, you can see how many acres are in each of these categories of phosphorus management. And this is what we call application management. This is not supported by your edge of field or anything. It's just simply how well are you putting your fertilizers on with rate, timing, and method of application. You can see the advantages of having a high level. If you've got a low level of management, your total P goes from 3.8. If you go to high, you go down to 0.9. It's a huge drop. So it shows that the 4R program is vital to controlling this issue out here. And following those 4 R's is a big deal. So if you can get in that moderately high and high range, which is basically where the 4R program is trying to get you, you start dropping those losses significantly. Another thing that we looked at, we talk about soil health. And something you have to really understand about soil health is that you have to look at the whole system. Don't just look at, oh, if carbon's going up, I got a healthy soil. Well, you might have a healthy soil, but you still may be doing some bad things out there due to over-application. You can have great carbon trend with over-application. So you need to have that balanced. So what you see here are the soils that we have in the systems that we have that are gaining soil carbon, which some people would say, okay, they're healthy. Well, let's take it one step further and look at which one of those have a comprehensive plan that addresses nitrogen and phosphorus losses, okay? So gaining carbon and a complete plan, you got corn yields at 175. They're putting on 15 pounds of P, only 7/10 being lost. They're putting on 180 pounds on average, that group is, of nitrogen, and only 22 are lost. But you go down to those that are gaining carbon, but not quite hitting their 4 Rs right. You can see you got a similar yield, but they're sticking on 15 more pounds of phosphorus, losing over 4 times more, and they're putting on more nitrogen, losing 8 pounds more. Okay? Let's go down to those. This gets back to why it's still important to be managing that soil carbon as well as your other resource concerns. Under-fertilized. So that group was pretty good, except for they were not putting on enough. So people running around and saying, you got to cut that fertilizer. Be careful what you ask for, because you can start hurting yield and increase losses, because you've got a less efficient plant. The plant's not performing, not utilizing the nutrients, the few nutrients that you did put out there, and so there's more nutrients left to be lost. So under-fertilization can be just as bad as over-fertilization. And that's something really to make sure you're doing this right, and it really leads us to that precision applications. Same story with nitrogen. You can have just as bad of problems doing that under-fertilization as you can with over. So after we look at all these surveys and look at all the ones that are exceeding different levels, we start looking at treatment needs and how many acres need this and how many acres need that. This is just a massive list of the different resource concerns at different levels that you have out there. Sediment, you can see that went from 10% exceeding 2 tons down to 4%. And of course, 2 tons is a threshold. If the basin needs less sediment than that, then that should, the basin average needs to go down, and it has. But so just because you've got 2 tons doesn't mean you can't do a little better to work as a group to lower the problem, and that is true for nitrogen and phosphorus as well. I'll just jump down to, you see total phosphorus at 3 pounds, kind of give you an idea why we dropped that threshold. Doesn't really show much as a problem at 3 pounds. 20% are exceeding it, 80% are doing just fine. You drop that down to 2 pounds, it's at 36%. You start looking at the soluble fractions to get down to a half pound or a pound, you can see where the issues start arising. You've got a lot of acres losing at a half pound, 44% losing at a pound in the soluble fraction. That's largely through tile, although there is some surface soluble. Once it gets to the stream, they don't, the critters in the stream don't care. It's soluble phosphorus to them. So, going back to thinking about comprehensive planning and why we keep pounding that as important to do. These are the average losses per acre if you don't meet any resource concern. Fortunately, we had less than 1% of the acres that weren't meeting any resource concern, but they're losing nearly 15 tons of sediment. 122 pounds, the carbon's confusing to talk about, that's how much is not lost. That's how much is lost that could be saved. It's a little difficult. You can see when you hit all 5 resource concerns, one of them is gain carbon or not lose carbon, so that group is 0 because they're hitting it. But the big numbers out here, huge numbers in that few percent. There's statistical issues. We're looking at less than 1% anyway, so I don't really think about that one too much. But if you look down to just hitting 2 of them versus hitting all of them in sediment, you go from 1.4 down to 2.2 tons. So there's a big savings in sediment there. Same thing, 34 pounds of nitrogen total down to 16. 4 pounds of total phosphorus down to 0.6, and 3 pounds of soluble down to 0.4 when you hit all 5 of your resource concerns, and you only do that with planning every acre. This is the percent of loads. We talk about the few causing the many problems. Go back to the only meeting 2 resource concerns. That one's accounting for 65% of the sediment. Those acres are. Those acres are accounting for 30% of the nitrogen, the subsurface nitrogen, 45% of total phosphorus, and 42% of soluble. Just in those few acres that are in that. See, 17% of the acres, 65% of the sediment, 42% of the soluble. So they're out of balance with their proportions on the landscape. Now here's where it gets down to the serious part. We show how many acres need that treatment, but they're not all in one single field. These soils exist on a mosaic of soils out in a field. So if you look at this one, the little red dot is one that's a highly erodible. That's that 4% that are still exceeding the 2-ton threshold. Well, that's where they occur, in little corners and little patches, either at the edge of a field or even out in the middle of a field. So you can't just run out there and find all those without a plan. And then you decide, what do I do with them, is the next part. So you have to go out there, look at the soils as they exist. So the targeting is not such that you're going out to this 12-digit huck or that one or whatever. Targeting is such that you're going out here and finding the issues that are in your field and changing your conservation to meet them. And this is where the precision ag is really going to help, because as we've talked about over and over again, it's this minority of acres. Well, since they exist all over the place, the only way to get at them is through precision technologies, is to find them and then address them appropriately from there. One of our pet peeves a little bit is we run across, everyone likes the common concept of a DMP, and they'll pick out 2 or 3 practices, and they're their favorites, and they're their DMPs. Well, they don't work everywhere. They're going to miss on this field horribly, because you've got highly leached soils, high subsurface losses, and you've got big runoff areas. So you've got different things that have to happen in this one field. So if you just go out and apply one DMP, you may have part of it, but you still may have a problem or even exacerbate a problem in another part of the field. So the best DMP is acting on a good comprehensive conservation plan. It starts there. Comprehensive plans and more precise soil testing is the start. So as I just now talked bad about DMPs, we had a list of them that we were going to do, where we went out and we applied filter strips in a blanket approach. Everybody gets filter strips or some other type of erosion control. And in our rule set, we have a scenario that if you're not next to a stream or some open water body, which could be a main canal or something, if you're next to one of those, you need to have a riparian buffer. Otherwise, a filter strip's good. This is what happens. This is a really flat field, but you got a lot of rain, like last night. So there's not much there. There's the main line where the tile drains are out, but the soil is wetter and getting more rain than that tile can handle, and that's what starts your surface runoff on flat fields. So this is where, although that thing's flat, I don't need any surface erosion control. Well, yeah, you kind of do. And so we'll push that back a little bit, protect that ditch bank, because it's taking a lot of stuff with it that we don't even know how to calculate that kind of action. And so work on this type of effort. Another thing to talk about here is drainage water management. That is, if you do it in a highly technical way, or even if you do it in the old-fashioned way of flashboard risers that you just bring a board up and down to regulate the water depth, when you get a big event, those tiles can only handle so much. So just because you're using drainage water management does not mean that you can't or don't need to support that with surface runoff control as well, because of those few events that this happens on. And again, going all the way back to talking about not only is the few acres, but even all the acres are suffering significant impacts on just 4 or 5 days out of the year at best. Cover crops. You'll notice in my previous slides about cover crop, about practices being applied. The cover crop interest craze, if you will, was just barely getting started in 2012, the fall of 2012, when we surveyed the farmers. So we only picked up 6% of the acres with cover crops, which in 03-06 we only had 2%. So, and that statistically there was no difference. The 15-16 survey, I suspect we're going to see a very significant jump in that, and be able to talk about it quite a lot. But we do have that as one of our scenarios.